There is a cartoon on television that has been running since before the turn of the millennium. It premiered on a Sunday night in January of 1999 following one of the most watched sporting events in the country. It pulled in 22 million viewers that first night. It was canceled. Then it was resurrected. Then it was canceled again. Then it came back a second time, stronger than before, and it has never left since. As of right now, it has aired more than 400 episodes across more than 20 seasons. It has been banned in foreign countries. It has had scenes quietly removed from its own archive. It has had episodes that never made it to American television at all, even though they were made for American television and paid for by American networks. It has generated government complaints and advertiser boycotts and congressional concern. It has made people laugh until they could not breathe and made other people furious enough to write letters to federal agencies. And somewhere underneath all of that noise, it has been quietly hiding things. Layers. Truths. The kind of depth that most people never look for in a cartoon about a fat man and his family in a made-up town in Rhode Island. That show is Family Guy. And tonight, we are going to go slow. We are going to go quiet. We are going to peel back the surface of this thing that has been part of the cultural landscape for over a quarter of a century and see what is actually underneath it. This is not a video about the best episodes or the funniest moments or the most controversial jokes. This is a deep dive into the lore, the actual origin story, the hidden architecture, the fan theories that reframe everything you thought you knew, the creative decisions that change the show's DNA, the eerie coincidences that nobody has ever fully explained, and the real human life that lives behind the cartoon one. So settle in. Get comfortable. The room can be dark. The volume can be low. This kind of story rewards patience and a quiet mind. And by the time we reach the end, I think you will see Family Guy differently than you did when we started. Let us begin. Section 1. The birth of something unusual. How a college thesis film became a television empire. To understand why Family Guy is the way it is, why it has the specific sense of humor it has, why it is set where it is set, why the characters are built the way they are built, you have to go back to a moment that happened not in a television studio or a network boardroom, but in a college classroom in Providence, Rhode Island in 1995. A senior student at the Rhode Island School of Design sat down and made his thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry. And almost nothing about that sentence suggests that 25 years later, the work it produced would be one of the most watched programs in the history of animation. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973 in Kent, Connecticut. His parents, Ronald and Ann, met in 1970 in Boston, married later that year, and moved to Kent in 1972. His father was a teacher at the Kent School, one of the most prestigious college preparatory schools in Connecticut. His mother worked in college admissions. The family was not wealthy in any ostentatious sense, but they were deeply intellectual, and in a household where education was the primary currency, a child with creative gifts received the exact right kind of attention. MacFarlane began drawing at the age of 2, not as a cute party trick, as a genuine compulsion. He drew Woody Woodpecker. He drew Fred Flintstone. He absorbed the visual vocabulary of animation before he had the words to describe what animation was, and he began making it his own almost immediately. By the time he was 8 years old, Seth MacFarlane had written and drawn his own comic strip called Walter Cruton, and that strip was being published in a local Connecticut newspaper called the Kent Dispatch. 8 years old. Published. This is not the kind of developmental milestone you see in very many biographies, which most 8-year-olds are drawing on paper bags and refrigerator doors. This particular 8-year-old had an audience and a regular column. The gap between that child and the adult who would eventually pitch a television show to Fox is smaller than you might think. The ambition was always there. The compulsion to put things down on paper and show them to people was always there, and the specific humor was beginning to emerge even then. He attended high school at the Kent School, where his parents had connections, and he kept drawing and animating through all 4 years of that education. His parents gave him an 8mm camera, which he used to begin making small films. The cartoons were getting more sophisticated, the humor was getting darker and more layered. He was consuming everything he could find: old movies, classic television comedies, jazz records, Broadway cast albums, the work of everyone from Mel Brooks to Hitchcock to Woody Allen. He had the particular appetite of someone who does not just enjoy things, but needs to understand how they were built and why they work, so that he can eventually build something himself. After high school, McFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design. RISD, as it is universally known, is one of the most respected art and design institutions in the country, and it sits in Providence in a way that feels almost meant to be. Because Providence is a city with a very specific character that would eventually imprint itself all over Family Guy in ways both obvious and hidden. It is old. It has cobblestone streets and a waterfront and architecture from 3 different centuries, all existing side by side without apparent concern for the inconsistency. It has the unhurried confidence of a place that has been there long enough to stop worrying about what anyone else thinks of it. It is the kind of city that leaves a mark on you if you spend 4 years inside it when you are 19 to 23 years old. At RISD, McFarlane studied animation with the initial goal of working for Disney. This is important to understand because the Disney of the late 1980s and early 1990s was in the middle of one of its most extraordinary creative periods. The Little Mermaid came out in 1989. Beauty and the Beast in 1991. Aladdin in 1992. The Lion King in 1994. These were films that felt genuinely important, lavishly animated, musically sophisticated, emotionally ambitious in ways that animated features had not always been. For a young person who loved animation and storytelling and music, wanting to be part of that world was an entirely reasonable and understandable ambition. But something happened during McFarlane's time at RISD that changed his trajectory. He saw The Simpsons. The Simpsons had premiered in 1989, the same year as The Little Mermaid, and it was doing something radically different from anything Disney was doing. It was messy and irreverent. It made jokes about the ordinary, dysfunctional texture of American middle-class family life. It did not romanticize, it did not sentimentalize. It took a family that was, in many ways, failing by the standards that television usually celebrated, and it found them funny and real and worth caring about. And it proved that animation could be adult. It proved that animation could be sharp and political and genuinely sophisticated without losing its ability to make people laugh. And for a young man whose sense of humor was already running darker than Disney's, this was a revelation. So the Disney ambition receded and something else took shape. In his senior year at RISD, McFarlane created his thesis film. He built it around 2 characters, a heavyset, not particularly intelligent man named Larry and his dog named Steve. These 2 characters were clearly prototypes for the people who would become Peter and Brian Griffin. Larry had Peter's general shape and disposition. Steve had Brian's intellectual remove and dry manner. About the dynamic between them, the bumbling human accompanied by the dog who is somehow the most grounded and sensible presence in every room, was there from the very beginning. The life of Larry was submitted by one of McFarlane's professors at RISD to the legendary animation studio Hanna-Barbera, and Hanna-Barbera was interested enough to hire him directly from the Student Film Festival. He was recruited by development executive Ellen Cockrell and company president Fred Seibert based on the creative content of his thesis film rather than his technical drawing ability, which is itself a significant detail. They were hiring his ideas and his voice, not just his craft. McFarlane graduated in 1995 with his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and moved to Los Angeles to begin his professional career. At Hanna-Barbera, he worked as both an animator and a writer on Johnny Bravo, on Cow and Chicken, on Dexter's Laboratory. These were not obscure projects. They were popular, well-produced shows with devoted audiences. But McFarlane's heart was still with Larry and Steve. He continued developing them, and in 1997 he made a sequel short called Larry and Steve, which aired as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons. This sequel featured a middle-aged man named Larry and his highly intelligent, articulate dog named Steve. It was essentially Family Guy in outline, waiting for the rest of the pieces to arrive. When executives at Fox saw these shorts, they moved quickly. They came to McFarlane and asked him if he wanted to create a series based around these characters. McFarlane has said that he assumed the pilot they wanted was going to be used as filler material for the sketch comedy show Mad TV, which Fox was producing at the time. He built the pilot without fully understanding how seriously the network was taking it. He added Lois, the patient, practical wife who would serve as the show's conscience and Peter's most honest mirror. He added Meg, a normal teenager defined primarily by her ordinariness in the context of an extraordinary household. He added Chris, an awkward, sweet-natured son with a specific voice that we will come back to shortly. He added Stewie. And here is where the show became something genuinely unprecedented. And he brought Brian forward from the Larry and Steve prototype, gave him more dimension, and built a world around all of them in the fictional city of Quahog, Rhode Island. Fox gave him a budget of $50,000 and asked for a 15-minute demonstration. McFarlane pitched the completed demo to Fox on May 15, 1998, and Fox's response was immediate. They scrapped their original idea of using it as insert material. They ordered it to series. The show premiered on January 31, 1999, in what is universally considered the single best time slot in network television, the post-Super Bowl slot. The Super Bowl that year was Super Bowl 33 between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons, and it drew an audience of approximately 80 million people. When the game ended and Family Guy began, it pulled in around 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated show from a first-time showrunner with no pre-existing audience, those numbers were extraordinary. And what those 22 million people found was something unlike anything that had existed before. Not a Simpsons clone, though the debt to The Simpsons was visible. Something that had taken the structural permission that The Simpsons granted, adult animation, family dysfunction, satire of American life, and gone somewhere entirely different with it. The Simpsons, even at its most cynical, was built on a foundation of love. Homer may have been a fool, but he loved his family, and the show's emotional engine was always running underneath the comedy, always connecting the laughter to something real. Family Guy had love in it too, but it also had something darker. A willingness to be genuinely cruel, a tolerance for discomfort that The Simpsons never quite had, and a sense of humor that treated nothing as sacred. And at the center of it was a man who had spent 4 years in Providence, who loved jazz records and Hitchcock films, who had barely survived the cancellation of his first 2 animated shorts, and who had somehow, at the age of 25, been handed the keys to one of the biggest creative platforms in American television. If you are watching or listening right now, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are and what time it is. I love hearing from this community. And if you are enjoying this kind of slow, deep lore telling, please do subscribe. It genuinely means everything to this channel and helps us keep making these videos for you. Section 2. The Man Behind the Curtain. Seth MacFarlane's Hidden Architecture. There is something almost vertiginous about the way Seth MacFarlane built Family Guy once you fully understand it. He did not just create the show. He did not just design the characters and the world and the tone. He voices 4 of the show's 6 central characters. 4. Peter Griffin, the main character, the face of the show, its primary engine of comedy and chaos. That is MacFarlane. Brian Griffin, the family dog who serves as the show's voice of reason and its most emotionally honest presence. That is also MacFarlane, in his own natural speaking voice without affectation or character work, just himself. Stewie Griffin, the evil genius baby with the British accent and the world domination schemes, the most theatrical and elaborate character in the show's history. That is MacFarlane doing something extraordinary with the memory of an old Rex Harrison performance. And Glenn Quagmire, the relentlessly lecherous neighbor who somehow manages to be both the most morally bankrupt and occasionally the most perceptive character in Quahog. That is also MacFarlane, in a voice that has become one of the most recognizable character voices in American animation. This means that a significant portion of the conversations you hear on Family Guy are Seth MacFarlane talking to himself. Peter argues with Brian about something pointless. Stewie tells Quagmire something unexpected. Brian tries to explain something to Peter while Peter fails to understand. All of these exchanges are one man in a recording booth, switching between 4 distinct personalities, finding the rhythm of dialogue between characters that he himself contains. The voice inspirations are themselves a small window into the show's deeper architecture. Peter's voice, as MacFarlane has confirmed in various interviews, came directly from a real person, a security guard who worked at the Rhode Island School of Design while McFarlane was a student there. McFarlane would encounter this man regularly on the RISD campus, would overhear him talking to people in the particular unhurried, self-confident tone of a certain kind of New England working-class man, and he stored that voice away without knowing why. Years later, when he needed a sound for Peter Griffin, a lovable, dim-witted father from a specific corner of the American Northeast, that guard's voice was there. But McFarlane has never publicly identified who the man was, which is an act of quiet respect for someone who almost certainly has no idea that the cadence of his speech has been heard by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Stewie's voice, as noted, is based on Rex Harrison, specifically Harrison's performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady, in which Harrison played a linguist so obsessed with precision of speech and so contemptuous of anyone who failed to meet his standards that he was essentially a villain dressed as a protagonist. The clipped precision, the theatrical emphasis, the barely contained irritation at the inadequacy of everyone around him, McFarlane took all of that and filtered it through the most outrageous possible juxtaposition: a one-year-old baby in a diaper. The fact that McFarlane chose Rex Harrison as his model, rather than, say, any number of more obvious British actor choices, tells you something about the depth and specificity of his cultural references. He was not reaching for the most recognizable British accent. He was reaching for a very particular character type, the brilliant, imperious intellectual who has no patience for those who cannot keep up with him, and finding the exact actor who embodied that type most completely. Brian, as already mentioned, is voiced in McFarlane's own natural speaking voice. There is no character work there, no accent, no affectation, no deliberate construction. When you hear Brian Griffin, you are hearing Seth MacFarlane with nothing between him and the microphone. This is significant because Brian is also the character who most consistently expresses viewpoints that MacFarlane himself holds on politics, on religion, on literature, on the state of American culture. Brian is a liberal. Brian is an atheist. Brian reads books and has opinions about them. Brian is a failed writer who genuinely wants to be taken seriously as an artist and is frustrated by the gap between his ambitions and his output. These are not invented character traits assigned to a cartoon for comic effect. These are real human traits that McFarlane has made no secret of recognizing in himself. The connection goes deeper. Brian drinks too much. He is attracted to women who are complicated and often wrong for him. He is sometimes arrogant in ways that undercut his more genuine qualities. He is deeply loyal to the people he loves, but that loyalty sometimes gets overridden by his own insecurities. He wants very badly to be respected and recognized, and the gap between how much he wants that and how consistently he fails to achieve it is a source of ongoing, low-grade pain. All of these things are things that McFarlane has touched on in interviews, in his comedy, and in the decisions he has made about Brian as a character over the years. Brian is not just a character. Brian is a confession. McFarlane's production company is called Fuzzy Door Productions, and the name comes from a very specific detail of his time at RISD that he has mentioned in interviews and commentary tracks over the years. The door of his dorm room had a fuzzy leopard print covering stapled to it, an act of eccentric personal decoration that his fellow students apparently found memorable and slightly odd. He held on to that memory, and when it came time to name his company, he reached for it. This is the kind of small, textured detail that tells you something about how a mind works. Most people would not have thought to use that as a company name. Most people would have gone for something that sounded more impressive or more professional. McFarlane went for something personal and slightly absurd, and entirely specific to a particular moment in his particular life. His love of jazz and big band music runs deeper than most Family Guy fans realize. He has released 9 studio albums of classic standards in the style of Frank Sinatra. That he recorded his first album using a microphone that Sinatra himself had actually used to record. He hired vocal coaches who had worked with Sinatra. He received 5 Grammy nominations for this work. This is not a celebrity vanity project. This is someone who has spent decades seriously studying a form of American musical expression and trying to do it justice. And it bleeds into Family Guy constantly. The show contains more genuine musical craft than almost any other animated program in broadcast television history. The elaborate production numbers in the road to episodes are not the work of a comedy show doing music. They are the work of a musician doing comedy, and the difference is audible. The road to episodes themselves are directly modeled after the road to comedy films of Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, a series of films produced between 1940 and 1962 in which Crosby and Hope played slightly exaggerated versions of themselves, going on improbable adventures in exotic locations. McFarlane has cited these films as a direct inspiration, and the template is clear. Brian and Stewie traveling to remote or fantastical places, getting into trouble, relying on each other, and sharing the kind of honest, emotionally weighted conversations that the normal episode format cannot sustain. The road to episodes are where the show slows down enough to let its two most interesting characters actually breathe. What this all amounts to is a show that is far more deliberately constructed and far more personally expressive than its public reputation suggests. Family Guy is not, or at least was not in its original conception, a random joke machine. And it was a very specific artistic statement from a very specific person, full of deliberate choices and careful constructions and personal references and cultural touchstones that reward the kind of attention that most people never bring to a cartoon about a man who fights a giant chicken. Section 3. Building Quahog, the Real World. Hidden inside the fiction. Quahog, Rhode Island, is where the Griffins live. It is a fictional city, but it is built from real materials. Real geography, real history, real names, real memories, in ways that most of the show's audience has never fully appreciated. And once you understand the layers of real life that are embedded in the show's fictional setting, Quahog stops being a generic cartoon backdrop and starts feeling like a very specific act of love for a very specific place. A quahog, pronounced roughly as quahog or quahog, depending on who you ask, is a type of hard-shell clam native to the Atlantic coast of North America. It is particularly associated with New England, and in Rhode Island specifically, it has been a staple food for centuries, harvested from the coastal waters and eaten raw, baked, or in chowder. It is a working-class food, the kind of thing that does not appear on fancy menus, the kind of thing that people who have lived in the same coastal town for generations know how to prepare without thinking about it. Naming your fictional town after a clam is itself a kind of down-to-earth statement about what kind of place Quahog is supposed to be. But there is a darker layer, in a detail that is buried in the show's own extended mythology and rarely discussed in mainstream coverage. Quahog was reportedly named after a real person, Lenny the Quahog Paradiso, a mafioso and convicted murderer from Rhode Island. Paradiso was a genuinely sinister figure in the state's criminal history, and someone saw fit to connect his nickname to the show's setting. Whether this was McFarlane's intention or a detail added by one of the writers during the show's development is unclear, but it is perfectly in keeping with the show's willingness to find dark humor in specific, real-world material. The town is modeled on Cranston, Rhode Island, which McFarlane has confirmed directly in an interview with Providence's local Fox affiliate. Cranston is a city just south of Providence, part of the Providence metropolitan area. So with the specific character of a place that is urban enough to have edge, but suburban enough to have lawns and front porches and neighborhood bars, where everyone knows each other. The Griffin family's street, Spooner Street, takes its name from Spooner Hill Road in the town of Chepachet, Connecticut, which is where McFarlane grew up. He literally named the street the Griffin family lives on after the road he was raised on. This kind of autobiographical detail, slipped quietly into the background of a show that seems to be about nothing but jokes, is characteristic of how the whole thing was constructed. James Woods Regional High School, where Meg, Chris, and eventually various other characters attend, is named after the actual actor James Woods, who was born in Vernal, Utah, but grew up in Warwick, Rhode Island, making him a genuine local figure. The school's name is both an homage to Woods' Rhode Island connection and, given some of what happens at that school over the course of the show, a fairly pointed irony. James Woods himself appeared in the show multiple times, voicing a fictional version of himself, making the naming of the school even more layered. Martin Mull Elementary, the show's fictional elementary school, is named after comedian, painter, and actor Martin Mull, who is himself a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, the same school McFarlane attended. 2 RISD alumni, 1 fictional elementary school. The Martin Mull reference would be meaningful to precisely the kind of person who would know that Mull had attended RYSD, which is to say, a very specific and rather self-selecting audience. Buddy Chianti Junior High is named after Vincent Buddy Chianti, one of the most complicated and colorful political figures in Rhode Island history. Chianti served as mayor of Providence for a total of over 21 years across 2 separate stints. Became famous as the driving force behind the revitalization of downtown Providence in the 1990s, and was ultimately convicted of racketeering in 2002 and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He was a man who built beautiful public spaces and made the city more livable while simultaneously running what federal prosecutors characterized as a criminal enterprise. He wore a toupee and a fake eye and an aftershave that people in Providence still mention with a strange combination of fondness and horror. And he is one of those quintessentially American political figures who cannot be reduced to a simple moral accounting, and naming a junior high school after him in a cartoon is the kind of joke that only lands if you know who he was. Which is to say, it lands perfectly for anyone from Rhode Island and floats gently over the heads of everyone else, which is itself a very Family Guy kind of move. The Providence skyline appears in the background of nearly every episode of Family Guy. Not a generic urban silhouette, but the actual recognizable skyline of downtown Providence. The specific shapes of the buildings, the church steeples, the way the city sits in relation to the water. If you grew up in Providence or spent time there, the background of a typical Quahog outdoor scene carries a kind of uncanny familiarity. A sense of almost recognizing where you are without quite being able to place it. Pawtucket, which is a real city northeast of Providence with its own strong identity, gives its name to Pawtucket Patriot Ale, Peter's beloved beer, and to the Pawtucket Brewery, Peter's longtime workplace. Pawtucket is a working-class city with a history deeply connected to American manufacturing and labor movements, and there is something appropriate about naming Peter's favorite beer and his place of employment after it. Peter is a working-class character. His world is rooted in the material, uncomplicated reality of a man who punches in, does his job, goes to the bar with his friends, and goes home. Pawtucket is an appropriate home for that kind of life. The Clam metaphor extends beyond the town's name in interesting ways once you start looking. Quahog clam is notoriously difficult to open. It takes a specific tool and a specific technique, and if you try to force it without knowing what you are doing, you are likely to injure yourself and still not get what you came for. Quahog the town is similarly resistant to easy understanding. It looks from the outside like a simple place full of simple people. Peter Griffin looks like a simple man. The show looks like a simple comedy. But like the Clam, there is something inside that rewards the effort of opening it properly. Section 4. The characters and their disturbing hidden depths. Let us spend some real time with the characters, because the characters of Family Guy carry inside them a level of psychological and narrative depth that the show itself only occasionally acknowledges directly, but which has fascinated and unsettled fans for the entire length of the show's existence. Start with Peter. In the early seasons, the first 3 before the cancellation, before the revival, before the gradual erosion of his better qualities, Peter Griffin is a specific and carefully constructed comedic archetype. He is the lovable American fool, the working-class husband and father who is not very smart and makes genuinely terrible decisions and stumbles through life causing more problems than he solves, but who loves his family with a sincerity that functions as the show's emotional anchor. He drinks beer with his friends Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire at the Drunken Clam. He gets into ridiculous situations at his toy factory job. And he makes ill-considered choices that have consequences he did not anticipate and is genuinely surprised by. And at the end of most early episodes, he figures out what he did wrong. He apologizes, and he tries to make it right. This version of Peter works because his stupidity is grounded in a kind of innocence rather than malice. He is not a bad person who does bad things on purpose. He is a good person who happens to be limited, and there is an enormous difference between those 2 readings of a character. The early Peter makes you laugh and makes you like him at the same time, and the reason that combination is possible is that his love for his family is never in doubt. Even when he does something foolish that hurts them, you believe that he did not intend to hurt them, and you believe that when he realizes he has, and it genuinely pains him. Compare this to the Peter of the later seasons, and the contrast is stark enough to be almost disturbing. By the time you reach season 8 or 9 and beyond, the show has stripped away the innocence that made early Peter funny and replaced it with something that has the shape of a character but none of the warmth. He is still large and slow and comedically obtuse, but the underlying decency that made those qualities endearing has been hollowed out. He does cruel things not because he failed to think them through, but because he does not appear to care about the consequences at all. He is unkind to his daughter in ways that go far beyond inattentiveness. That he does things to his friends that are not the actions of someone who simply made a mistake. They are the actions of someone who saw an opportunity and took it without a second thought for anyone else. There is a speech in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party that lays this transformation out more clearly than any critical analysis could. Meg Griffin, after years of accumulated abuse from her family, finally confronts Peter and delivers an inventory of his failings with a precision and a rawness that the show rarely allows. She calls him completely selfish. She calls him totally irresponsible as a father. She describes specific behaviors, real behaviors, behaviors that actually happened in episodes we watched, and names them for what they are. And the thing that makes this moment so revealing is not what Meg says. Now, it is what Peter does when she says it. He laughs. He is amused. He feels nothing that you could charitably describe as shame or guilt or even mild discomfort. He laughs at his own daughter, telling him that he is a terrible father. Now, the show presents this as comedy, and it lands as comedy in the moment because the show has built its audience to expect that reaction from Peter. But if you sit with it for a few minutes after the episode ends, something shifts. You realize that the show has just admitted, through Meg's speech, that Peter has become something genuinely disturbing. And Peter's laughter confirms it, because the Peter of season 1 would not have laughed. He might not have fully understood the speech. He might have gotten defensive or confused or hurt in some inarticulate way, but he would not have laughed. The early Peter had the capacity to feel called out. The later Peter has been stripped of that capacity. And a character who cannot be reached by anything, who cannot feel the weight of another person's pain directed at him, is not a lovable fool. He is something else. The fan theory that has grown up around this transformation is one of the most tenacious and uncomfortable ideas that Family Guy lore has generated. The theory goes that the events of Family Guy do not reflect objective reality. They reflect the interior landscape of Peter Griffin's traumatized mind. Specifically, one night, Meg and Chris were killed in a drunk driving accident. They were coming home from a party. The car went off the road. They both died. Lois, who was pregnant with Stewie at the time, was destroyed by grief. Perhaps she harmed herself? Not perhaps she simply became unreachable in the way that devastating loss sometimes makes people unreachable. And Peter, unable to survive the reality of what had happened, retreated somewhere inside himself where none of it was true. In this reading, the Meg we see in the show, the one who is perpetually mistreated, who is blamed for everything, who is somehow the focal point of the family's dysfunction, is filtered through Peter's unconscious guilt about the daughter whose death he holds responsible for his family's destruction. She was driving, in the theory, or he believes she was driving, and the cruelty with which his mind depicts her is a displacement of an anger he cannot consciously own. The Chris we see, the one who is heavy and slow and not quite right, is Peter's memory of his son, faded and distorted by years of grief, the details blurring. Lois has episodes of behavior that seem inconsistent with who she was in the early seasons because the Lois in Peter's constructed reality is slowly forgetting. A memory cannot stay sharp forever. The Stewie we see, the genius baby, is who Peter imagined his unborn son would be, projected onto an infant he never got to know, a repository for all the hope and promise that died when his actual family did. And Brian. Brian talks because, in Peter's mind, the dog was the one who stayed. The one who was there, the one who, through loyalty and daily presence, became something more than an animal in the interior world Peter built. This is not canon. The show will never confirm it. But the theory is built from real textual details, things the show has actually said and done, and it has a coherence that is hard to dismiss. It transforms what looks like a comedy about a silly family into a sustained portrait of grief and psychological collapse. all of it wrapped in cartoon comedy so that you can look at it without being devastated. Now, Stewie. The original Stewie Griffin is one of the most genuinely original characters in the history of animated television, and the specificity of what makes him work is worth dwelling on. He is 1 year old. He cannot walk independently, he cannot feed himself. He sits in a high chair and is fed formula and strained peas and made to wear a diaper. And he accepts these indignities with the patience of someone who knows that his power does not currently reside in his physical capabilities, but in his mind, which is extraordinary. He builds weapons in his bedroom, ray guns, time machines, mind control devices, weather modification systems. He speaks like a British stage actor with elaborate precision and theatrical emphasis. He wants to kill his mother and take over the world. And almost nobody around him realizes any of this. The dramatic irony is the engine that drives every Stewie scene in the original seasons. Lois picks this baby up, holds him, coos at him, and has no idea that the creature in her arms has spent the morning working on a new scheme to destroy her. Other adults hear Stewie talking and understand nothing. To them, he is babbling. To the audience, he is delivering monologues of extraordinary sophistication. The gap between what Stewie is and what Stewie looks like is inexhaustible as a source of comedy because the gap never closes. No matter how elaborate his plans, no matter how many weapons he constructs, no matter how close he comes to actually achieving something terrible, he is still a baby. He still gets put down for naps. He still has to be carried when he wants to move quickly. The contrast between the magnitude of his inner life and the complete helplessness of his outer circumstances is something you could build a character on forever. The fan theory that the entire show is a manifestation of Stewie's perception of the world is perhaps the most intellectually generous reading of Family Guy as a whole. That the argument is that we are not seeing objective reality when we watch Family Guy. We are seeing the world as Stewie's infant mind constructs it, filtered through his limited but extraordinary intelligence. Peter is oafish and chaotic in Stewie's perception, because Peter is the large, unpredictable man who controls aspects of Stewie's environment, and who is himself often frightening or incomprehensible. Lois is the controlling authority figure, the one who feeds him and puts him down and sets the rules of his existence. And so in Stewie's mind, she becomes the central obstacle, the thing that must be overcome. Meg fights with her parents all the time, which an infant would perceive as the family being hostile toward Meg. Brian does not actually talk. He is a dog. But an infant who has not yet firmly established the boundaries between animate and inanimate, between human and non-human, might grant the family dog the gift of speech because the dog feels like family and family members speak. This theory is supported by a structural detail that the show has never directly addressed. Why is it that some people can understand Stewie and some people cannot? In many episodes, characters clearly hear Stewie speaking intelligibly and respond to what he says. In others, characters seem to hear only unintelligible infant noise. The inconsistency has no in-universe explanation unless you accept that what we are watching is not consistent objective reality, but a representation of Stewie's interior experience, which would naturally be inconsistent because the mind of a 1-year-old is inconsistent. And then there is the question of Stewie's possible biological parentage, which is one of the most quietly disturbing threads in all of Family Guy lore. In the episode Partial Terms of Endearment, the one that was banned from American television, which we will discuss at length in a later section, there is a moment where Lois, in what appears to be a throwaway gag, says that Meg gave birth to Stewie. The line gets no reaction from Meg. She does not deny it. She does not laugh it off. She simply does not respond, and the conversation moves on. Fan theorists have spent years asking what to do with that silence. The theory that has grown up around it goes like this. Meg, who would have been roughly 15 or 16 when Stewie was born, based on the ages the show establishes, became pregnant by a boyfriend. Lois and Peter, faced with the reality of a teenage pregnancy in their household, made the decision to raise the child as their own. Meg agreed to this, whether willingly or under pressure, and Stewie was presented to the world as Lois's son. The theory suggests that Stewie's specific fixation on Lois, his obsessive, persistent, murderous hatred of her, may not be the irrational scheme of a baby supervillain. It may be some wordless, primal awareness that the woman he calls his mother is not actually his mother, that there is something wrong in the fundamental relational architecture of his family, that he is being deceived by the people he depends on for survival in the most basic possible way, and that the response to that deception, filtered through a mind that has not yet developed the language to name it, looks like a desire for destruction. This reading casts Meg's treatment throughout the show in an entirely different light. The family's cruelty toward Meg, which intensifies as the seasons go on to a degree that the show itself eventually acknowledges as disturbing, may not be random or habitual. It may be the expression of a shared guilt about what was done to her, a collective displacement of shame onto the person whose sacrifice made the family's current configuration possible. These are theories, but they are theories built from real details in a real show, and they reveal something important about why Family Guy has retained such a grip on its most dedicated fans, even through the years when the show's quality declined significantly. The lore runs deep. The architecture, once you start looking at it, is more intricate than anyone set out to build. And the characters, even the ones who have been degraded and simplified by years of lazy writing, still carry inside them the traces of what they were originally meant to be. Section 5. The darkest fan theories that actually make sense. We have touched on some of the show's most unsettling theories already, but there are others that deserve their own careful examination, because each one illuminates a different aspect of what Family Guy might actually be about at its deepest level. Start with the two-universe theory, which is one of the most discussed pieces of Family Guy fan speculation, and which, once you encounter it, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The basic claim is this: the first 3 seasons of Family Guy and the post-revival seasons, from season 4 onward, do not take place in the same universe. They are 2 parallel versions of the Griffin family's story, set in 2 parallel versions of Quahog. And the reason the characters are different after the revival is not because of character development or writing changes, but because these are literally different characters living a different version of a similar life. The evidence cited is primarily observational. In the original seasons, Peter is dim but warm. He loves Meg. He is capable of genuine reflection and genuine apology. The family has dysfunction, but it has visible love underneath the dysfunction. After the revival, everything shifts. Peter's warmth disappears. Meg's treatment escalates from being overlooked to being actively persecuted. The family seems less like people who love each other badly and more like people who can barely tolerate each other's presence. The show becomes darker, stranger, more extreme, and less grounded in the recognizable emotional reality that the original seasons inhabited. The theory finds its most interesting textual support in the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, in which Stewie and Brian use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the events of the show's very first episode. While they are there, they observe the original characters, and those original characters are clearly different from the current ones, but not just in animation style, but in personality and behavior. The theory claims that Stewie and Brian did not actually travel in time. They crossed into a parallel universe, the original universe in which the show takes place. And when they returned home, they returned to the darker, meaner parallel universe that has been running since 2005. There is something almost comforting in this reading. It means the show you fell in love with is not gone or ruined. It exists somewhere intact, running on its original track. The Griffins of the original seasons are still out there in their version of Quahog, living the warmer, funnier, more emotionally honest version of their story. You just cannot get there from here. The theory about Brian being a human being in a dog's body is worth examining carefully, because unlike some fan theories, it is grounded in the show's own established internal logic rather than an extrapolation. In American Dad, a show that Family Guy has confirmed is part of the same fictional universe, there exists a character named Klaus, a German man whose consciousness was transferred into the body of a goldfish by the CIA. The technology is established, and it exists in this universe. A CIA scientist with the appropriate equipment and motivation could, in principle, transfer a human consciousness into an animal body, and the animal so created would behave exactly the way Brian Griffin behaves. Speaking fluent language, having complex opinions, writing things, driving cars, maintaining professional ambitions, dating human women, and producing a son who is biologically human, despite being technically born to a dog. The theory holds that Brian was a human being at some point before the story begins, perhaps a writer, given his persistent aspiration and occasional output, perhaps a man with the same general cultural tastes that Brian expresses throughout the show, and that at some point he was brought to the CIA facility and his consciousness was placed in a dog. Whether this was voluntary or involuntary is never suggested. Whether he has any memory of his previous life is never established. But the strangeness of Brian's situation, uniquely articulate among his litter of siblings, capable of things that no dog could be capable of, simultaneously proud of his intelligence and deeply insecure about his status, makes perfect sense if we understand that he is not actually a dog, but a person who woke up one morning in a dog's body and has been trying to live his life ever since. The idea that the Griffins are in some form of purgatory or spiritual consequence for their past lives is a theory that has circulated in various forms since the show's earliest seasons. The argument is that each member of the family is experiencing an ironic punishment designed specifically to torture them with what they most want and most lack simultaneously. Stewie is a genius, perhaps the most brilliant mind on the show, but he is trapped in the body of a helpless infant. He cannot act on his own. He cannot move freely. He cannot be taken seriously by anyone except Brian. He is entirely dependent on the very people he despises most. Lois is a woman of taste and intelligence and genuine capability who, based on her background as the daughter of wealthy, well-connected people, might have led a very different life. Instead, she is in a middle-class household, married to a man who is in many ways her opposite, surrounded by chaos. Brian wants desperately to be recognized as an intellectual and an artist. He is a dog. But no one outside the immediate family even understands that he can talk, let alone that he has written anything worth reading. Peter, who might in a previous life have been a man who let people down and failed to protect the people who depended on him, is now the center of a family that constantly needs his protection and is constantly failed by it. And Meg. In most purgatory readings of the show, Meg is the most interesting and the most troubling case, because Meg is not clearly being punished for anything. She is ordinary and kind and empathetic and capable of genuine moral seriousness when the show gives her the space to be. Her suffering is not ironic in the way that the others are. It is not the punishment for a recognizable vice or failing. It is just relentless and unearned, which suggests in the purgatory reading that Meg is not there because she sinned. She is there because everyone else did. The theory that Brian is writing Family Guy is perhaps the most structurally elegant of all the show's fan theories, and it is one that has been developed in fascinating detail by various fan communities. The basic claim is that Brian Griffin is the author of a fictionalized, exaggerated account of his family's life, and that Family Guy is that account. This would explain why Brian is present in virtually every episode, even the ones that seem to have nothing to do with him, because the author cannot narrate events he was not present for, so he inserts himself. It would explain the increasing exaggeration and darkness of the show's later seasons. Brian's growing alcoholism and self-doubt have degraded his writing, and what was once a grounded portrait of family life has become something grotesque and hyperbolic as the author's own judgment has deteriorated. It would explain the road to episodes where Brian and Stewie go on elaborate adventures. Those are the episodes Brian has the richest material for, because he was there and remembers every detail. And it would explain, with quiet sadness, why Brian is simultaneously the show's most sympathetic and most deeply flawed figure. Because a writer of a certain type cannot help putting both his best and his worst self on the page. And if Brian is the author, then everything we see about Brian is what Brian has decided to show us about himself. There is also the theory about Meg as a narrative anchor. The idea that Meg's consistent suffering throughout the show serves a function beyond comedy, not beyond simple cruelty, beyond lazy writing. The claim is that Meg is the show's moral center, the character whose treatment by others functions as a barometer of the show's ethical condition. When the show treats Meg well, it is a sign that the show is doing something right. When the show treats Meg cruelly without reflection or consequence, It is a sign that something has gone wrong in the show's relationship to its own values. Under this reading, the decline of Meg's treatment across the show's run is not an independent problem. It is a symptom of a larger problem, a visible register of the show's declining moral seriousness. And the fact that the worst period of Meg's abuse corresponds almost exactly to the period when Seth MacFarlane stepped back from active creative oversight of the show is not a coincidence. Section 6. The Prophecies. When Family Guy predicted reality. The show has, on multiple occasions, depicted things that later happened in the real world, in ways that generated genuine public unease. Most of these coincidences have explanations that do not require anything more mysterious than sharp cultural observation. But a few of them are strange enough that even the show's creators have expressed discomfort about them. The most widely discussed and most unsettling of the show's apparent predictive moments involves Caitlyn Jenner's gender transition. In two separate episodes from the mid-2000s, well over a decade before Jenner publicly came out in 2015, Family Guy depicted Bruce Jenner in strikingly feminine terms. In one episode, Stewie describes Bruce Jenner as an elegant, a beautiful Dutch woman, in a line delivered as absurdist comedy, the joke apparently being that Stewie is wrong about something self-evidently true. In another episode, Bruce Jenner is depicted as a flamboyant dancer performing for military personnel, in a way that transgresses the gender expectations attached to his public persona. These jokes, when they aired, read as simple celebrity mockery of an arbitrary target. When Jenner came out publicly, they were immediately recirculated with the label prediction, and the show's writers were asked about them. The writers' responses were characteristically deflective. There is no credible reason to believe that Family Guy's writing staff had access to private information about Jenner's gender identity years before she disclosed it publicly. But the cultural and social signals that would eventually lead to her coming out were available to careful observers of American celebrity culture long before they were acknowledged publicly, and a writing room full of people who paid very close attention to the texture of popular culture might have picked up on those signals without being able to explicitly articulate what they were registering. Satire sometimes sees what journalism has not yet found a way to say. The Boston Marathon situation is a different and more disturbing matter. In March of 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy. The episode's plot involved Peter befriending a man who turns out to have terrorist connections, which was already controversial territory. But the scene that caused the most lasting damage was a cutaway in which Peter wins the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of participants, running over many of them to reach the finish line. 1 month later, on April 15, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring more than 250. The proximity in time between the episode and the actual attack was disturbing enough to generate significant media attention. But what happened next was far worse. Like someone on the internet, the episode's Wikipedia page attributes the original spread of the fabricated version to the conspiracy broadcaster Alex Jones, took 2 completely separate scenes from the episode and edited them together to create what appeared to be footage of the episode depicting a bomb attack on the Boston Marathon. The edited video was entirely fabricated. There was no scene in the actual episode where the marathon bombing was depicted. But the fabricated clip spread with extraordinary speed across social media and conspiracy platforms, reaching millions of people before its falseness was widely established. Seth MacFarlane responded publicly and with considerable force. He called the fabricated video abhorrent. He described it as deeply disrespectful to the victims of the actual attack. But Fox pulled the episode from all of its online streaming platforms and removed it from rerun schedules, where it has remained absent ever since. MacFarlane's reaction tells you something important about the man. This is not someone who enjoyed the association between his work and real-world violence, even when the association was manufactured by someone else. There are show creators who might have found the attention useful, or who might have deflected with humor. MacFarlane's response was direct, unambiguous, and clearly distressed. The Dick Cheney hunting accident is a smaller coincidence, but a stranger one in some ways. In the episode Meet the Quagmires, which aired in 2007, Death tells Peter that Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia had been fatally shot by Dick Cheney in a hunting accident. a clear joke referencing the real incident in 2006 when Cheney accidentally shot his friend Harry Whittington while quail hunting. Scalia was, of course, not harmed in the original incident, but Scalia died in 2016 under circumstances that were initially described as unusual before being officially attributed to natural causes. And the episode's specific mention of Scalia dying while hunting with Cheney has been periodically resurfaced by fans as an uncomfortable data point. This one stretches the definition of prediction considerably. It is more accurately described as a dark joke that happened to share some surface elements with a later real event, filtered through the human tendency to find pattern in coincidence. But it is eerie enough to be worth noting. The Robin Williams situation deserves its own careful treatment because it involves real grief rather than political controversy. In a season 10 episode called Family Guy Presents Quagmire's Baby, actually in an episode that aired as part of a set of shorts, there is a storyline in which a character becomes cursed with the ability to transform everything they touch into Robin Williams, and the episode includes a sustained storyline involving attempts to escape this condition, including what can be read as a depiction of suicidal ideation. The episode aired in 2012 or early 2014, depending on which broadcast you are tracking. In August of 2014, Robin Williams died by suicide. On the day that news of his death broke publicly, the BBC in the United Kingdom happened to be airing the episode as part of their scheduled Family Guy programming. Viewers in the UK were watching an episode that contained a suicide-adjacent storyline involving Robin Williams at the exact moment they were also receiving news alerts about his actual death. This is not a prediction. No one planned this. The timing is a coincidence of the kind that, if you were to encounter it in a novel, you would dismiss as too contrived. But it happened. And the people who experienced that particular evening watching television in the UK, watching a cartoon Robin Williams die in a comic context while learning that the actual Robin Williams had died, encountered something that left a very specific kind of mark. The world is strange and sometimes cruel in its timing, and Family Guy has been on the air long enough, and referential enough about popular culture, that it has accumulated a significant number of moments where the cartoon and the real world intersected in ways that were not planned and were not comfortable. Section 7. The forbidden episodes and the content they tried to bury across all of its seasons, all of its controversies, all of the letters and complaints and regulatory filings it has generated, Family Guy has had exactly one episode completely banned from American television. 1. The show has pushed into territory that most programs would not touch, with regularity and apparent enthusiasm for a quarter of a century. And only once did the network draw a hard line. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was produced for season 8, but never aired on Fox in the United States. The episode deals with abortion, directly, without comic deflection, and without coming to a conclusion about which side of the argument is correct. Lois agrees to serve as a surrogate mother for an old college friend. The friend and her husband are then killed in a car accident. Lois and Peter are left to decide what to do with the pregnancy, and the episode explores that question with more genuine care and complexity than you might expect from a show that typically uses controversy as a delivery mechanism for punchlines. Fox's decision not to air the episode came before the season even began. At the San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, the Family Guy team announced that the episode would not be shown in America. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Riley gave the public explanation that the subject matter was too sensitive for the economic moment, which is a corporate way of saying that advertisers would have pulled their money. Seth MacFarlane called the episode too edgy for the network, which is a more honest way of saying the same thing with a certain amount of pride mixed into the resignation. The episode was not destroyed. The BBC in the United Kingdom aired it in prime time, where it reached approximately 1 million viewers in its first broadcast and received predominantly positive reviews. It is included in the Season 8 DVD release and has always been available to American viewers willing to purchase or import the physical media. But it has never aired on any American television network, yet has never appeared on Hulu, which streams the rest of the show, and has never been made available through any American streaming platform. More than 15 years after it was made, it remains genuinely inaccessible to the majority of the American audience for which it was created. The decision has an interesting ideological dimension. Family Guy has made countless jokes about abortion over the course of its run. Quick, throwaway gags that use the subject as a punchline without engaging with it as a real social issue. These jokes were never pulled. They were never banned. They provoked complaints, but not removal. What proved intolerable to Fox was not Family Guy using abortion as a subject for dark comedy that the network accepted. But what proved intolerable was Family Guy treating abortion as a real question deserving of genuine engagement. A joke about abortion can be defended as comedy. An actual episode that takes the question seriously asks the audience to think. And thinking about abortion is not something a broadcast network can afford to mandate for its advertisers' customers. Before the complete ban on partial terms of endearment, there was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the episode that was held back for 3 years before eventually airing. The episode was originally intended for season 2, but was pushed back to 2003 over fears that it would be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode's central joke is that Peter, facing financial difficulties, decides he needs to find a Jewish person to help him, because he has absorbed the stereotype that Jewish people are particularly smart and capable with money. He eventually befriends a man named Max Weinstein, who does help him financially, but the friendship eventually deteriorates when Peter pushes his stereotypical assumptions too far. The humor in the episode is partly at Peter's expense. His ignorance is being mocked as much as the stereotypes he holds, but Fox's executives felt the risk was too great. Adult Swim eventually aired it in 2003. Fox followed suit in 2004. Seth MacFarlane's relationship with the Parents Television Council, the most persistent and organized of the organizations that complained about the show, deserves a brief examination because it tells a story about how the show saw itself in relation to the cultural battles it was fighting. The PTC filed formal FCC complaints against Family Guy with regularity, citing specific episodes and scenes for violating broadcast decency standards. Their complaints were rarely successful in prompting regulatory action, and the show continued to air without significant alteration. MacFarlane's response to PTC criticism was generally one of amused contempt, though he occasionally acknowledged, in more reflective moments, that the show had gone too far on specific occasions. But the FCC situation was directly addressed in one of the show's most self-aware episodes, PTV, which aired in Season 4. In this episode, the FCC begins aggressively censoring content across all of Quahog's media, eventually extending to the Griffin's private behavior at home. The episode is a broadside against broadcast censorship, and it uses the format of the show itself to make its argument, featuring a montage of scenes from previous episodes that had been cut or altered for broadcast, presented as evidence of the creative cost of network standards. The episode received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Animated Program. It was, in other words, an argument against censorship that was itself censored in places when it aired. A perfect encapsulation of the show's complicated relationship with the institutional forces that governed its distribution. The censorship history of Family Guy in its granular detail, scene by scene, line by line, what was bleeped and what was cut, and what was reworded for which network and what was restored for DVD release, is extensive enough to fill a substantial document on its own. Disney Plus, which acquired Fox's content library, streams the censored broadcast versions rather than the uncut DVD versions, which means that viewers coming to the show through the most modern platform are actually seeing a more restricted version of it than viewers who bought the DVDs 20 years ago. This is one of those quiet, slightly strange details about the history of media preservation that is rarely discussed, but that matters for anyone who wants to understand what the show actually was versus what is currently most accessible. Section 8. The Genius of the Early Seasons. Let us spend some meaningful time with the early seasons of Family Guy because they deserve it, and because understanding what made them exceptional illuminates everything that came after. The first 3 seasons of Family Guy are, in retrospect, a genuinely remarkable achievement. This was not always the consensus. When the show first aired, many critics dismissed it as derivative and cheap, a show that took the structural permission granted by The Simpsons and deployed it without the depth or care that The Simpsons had brought to the form. The cutaway gags were called lazy. The characters were called thin. The humor was called random. Some of these criticisms had validity, but looking back now with the benefit of time and the ability to compare those early seasons to what the show became, the quality of the original run is difficult to overstate. What the early seasons had that the later seasons lost is, at its core, a sense of proportion. Every element was calibrated. Peter was stupid, but he was stupid in a way that felt grounded. He made bad decisions because he was impulsive and poorly informed, not because he lacked basic human understanding altogether. Brian was the voice of reason, but he was a voice of reason with genuine flaws. His pretensions were balanced by real self-awareness. His loneliness was balanced by real warmth. His drinking was a background note rather than a defining characteristic. Stewie was terrifying and brilliant, and the show committed to that premise with consistency and creativity, finding new ways to play with the contrast between his appearance and his interior life without ever exhausting the central joke. Lois was a genuinely capable woman, managing a genuinely impossible situation with patience and intelligence. Even Meg, who would later become the show's most tortured figure, was simply a normal teenager, navigating the particular indignity of being the least interesting person in an extraordinary family. The cutaway gags in the early seasons were genuinely clever, which is the quality most often overlooked in discussions of the show's comedy technique. But a cutaway works when the connection between the setup and the payoff is specific and surprising, when the joke the cutaway delivers is one that could only have arrived from the particular line or situation that prompted it. In the best early cutaways, the humor comes from unexpected specificity. Not just a random ridiculous scene, but a ridiculous scene that illuminates something true about the character or situation that spawned it. The cutaways were short. They were dense with specific detail. They arrived and departed quickly, adding a burst of extra comedy to an already functioning scene without replacing the scene's narrative momentum. You could remove the cutaways from an early season episode and still have a complete, funny, well-constructed story. The cutaways were the dessert, the story was the meal. The show's musical ambitions in the early seasons are also worth acknowledging at length. The original theme song, with its deliberate echoes of All in the Family's opening number, announced from the very beginning that this was a show with a deep respect for the history of the American family sitcom, even as it subjected that history to considerable abuse. The elaborate musical sequences in the Road to episodes, particularly Road to Rhode Island, which featured the extraordinary song Family Guy: A Love Story, and the strikingly honest duet between Brian and Stewie about the complications of their friendship, demonstrated a musical sophistication that had no peer in adult animation at the time and arguably has none today. But the emotional honesty of the early seasons is perhaps their most surprising quality, given the show's reputation for transgressive comedy. The Griffins in the original run were recognizably a family who loved each other. Not perfectly, not consistently, not always in ways that would survive scrutiny by anyone with healthy relationship standards. But the love was there, and it surfaced in ways that felt real rather than engineered. Peter would do something genuinely stupid and genuinely hurtful, and at the end of the episode he would realize it and apologize and mean it. Lois would lose patience with her family and then, in the same episode, demonstrate why she stayed. The moments of warmth were not isolated to the final 2 minutes of each episode as a narrative requirement, that they emerged naturally from the characters' relationships with each other, because the writers in the early seasons believed in those relationships and built them carefully. Section 9. The Man Who Missed the Plane. On the evening of September 10th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane gave a speech at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. He had been invited back to speak to students at the school where he had made The Life of Larry 6 years earlier, where he had spent 4 years becoming the person who would eventually create Family Guy, where he had met people who would become lifelong collaborators. After the speech, he went out with faculty members who had been his professors while other colleagues during his time there. He had drinks. He stayed out later than he perhaps planned to. When he finally went to sleep, it was in the knowledge that he had an early flight to catch the next morning. His travel agent had written down the departure time incorrectly on his itinerary. The flight, American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport, was scheduled to leave at 7:45 in the morning. His itinerary said 8:15. When MacFarlane arrived at the airport on the morning of September 11th, 2001, running late due to both the hangover and the incorrect time, the gate had just closed. He had missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes. He booked himself onto the next available departure, went into the airport lounge, and fell asleep. He was still asleep when he was woken, roughly 45 minutes later, by commotion in the lounge. He looked up at the television screens and saw that a plane had struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. He sat there and watched the second plane hit. He watched the news coverage unfold. And then he heard the announcement, boy, the first plane to strike the tower had been American Airlines Flight 11, departing Boston Logan at 7:45 in the morning. The flight he had been booked on. The flight he had missed because his travel agent wrote down the wrong time and he had stayed out drinking the night before. All 92 people on board Flight 11 were killed. Among the passengers were Frasier creator and executive producer David Angel and his wife Lynn, actress Barry Berenson, Akamai Technologies co-founder Daniel Lewin, who reportedly tried to resist the hijackers and became the first American to die on September 11th. The oldest victim of the September 11th attacks overall was Robert Grant Norton, 85 years old, who was also on Flight 11. Actor Mark Wahlberg, who was also scheduled to be on the flight, had at the last minute accepted an invitation to attend the Toronto Film Festival instead, and changed his plans the day before. McFarlane has spoken about this experience in various interviews over the years with a remarkable degree of equanimity. He has said that it did not affect him the way it might have because he never experienced the danger directly. He was never on the plane. He never had the experience of sitting in his seat as the flight changed course. But he woke up from a nap in an airport lounge and discovered that he had come within 10 minutes of dying, which is a very different psychological experience from the one he would have had if he had been on the plane. He framed it in one CNN interview in terms of a kind of philosophical acceptance. If it had been meant for him to be on that plane, he would have been. Whether this equanimity is genuine or is a very well-maintained public posture is impossible to know from the outside. What can be said is that he continued making Family Guy with apparently undiminished energy in the aftermath of the attacks, and that the show's third season aired in 2001 and 2002 in the shadow of September 11th's cultural reconfiguration without dramatically altering its tone or content. What is known, and what fans have spent considerable time examining, is the suggestion that the direct-to-video Family Guy feature Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, released in 2005 and incorporating material that was worked on during 2002 and 2003, contains a narrative that reads differently when you understand what McFarlane had been through. The film follows Stewie through a near-death experience that he should not have survived, and then watches Stewie respond to that near-death experience by becoming obsessed with undoing it, traveling back in time to prevent the event that nearly killed him, and celebrating with extraordinary intensity when he succeeds. Whether this is conscious autobiographical processing or simply a coincidence of narrative construction is something that only McFarlane could confirm and that he has never publicly addressed. But the structural parallel is there, and it is striking enough to be more than coincidental to some who have studied it carefully. The near miss also matters for understanding the show's relationship to a certain kind of dark humor about mortality. Family Guy has always been more willing than most shows to make jokes about death, about tragedy, about the randomness with which terrible things happen to ordinary people. Some of this is simply transgressive comedy, shock value, the pleasure of saying things that are not supposed to be said. But some of it reads, in the context of knowing what McFarlane experienced, as something more like the dark humor that people use when they are trying to process the fact that life can end arbitrarily and immediately, and that the only available response is to keep laughing. The show that McFarlane built is, among other things, about a sustained refusal to treat the fragility of existence as a reason for solemnity. And that refusal has a specific origin that is worth understanding. Section 10. The show within a show and the layers nobody talks about. One of the most persistent and least discussed elements of Family Guy lore is the question of what kind of reality the show is actually depicting. Is Quahog a real place within the show's universe? Is Family Guy a fictional television show within that universe? Is the Griffin family aware, on some level, that they are being watched? These questions have generated a substantial body of fan analysis, and the show itself has occasionally opened the door to them in ways that suggest the writers find the meta level of the show's existence genuinely interesting to play with. The episode Inside Family Guy, which aired in Season 15, is the most direct engagement with this question. The episode presents itself as a behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of Family Guy the television show, which is depicted as being filmed on a studio lot in Hollywood, with the Griffin family as actors playing fictionalized versions of themselves. This is a classic meta move, the show acknowledging its own fictional status, winking at the audience's awareness that they are watching a construction rather than a reality. But it creates a genuine question. If the Griffins are actors playing fictional versions of themselves, who are they when they are not on set? What is the version of the Griffin family that exists before and after the cameras are rolling? And is the thing we have been watching for 15 seasons the show? Or is it the real lives of the people making the show? The fact that American Dad has made multiple references to Family Guy as a television show watched by the Smith family complicates the metatexture further. If the characters in American Dad can watch Family Guy as a television program, then Family Guy is fiction within the universe that American Dad depicts as real. But if the two shows share a universe, which the show's own crossover episodes have suggested, then how can Family Guy be both a real event and a television show? The answer that some fans have proposed is that the Griffin family has signed a reality television agreement in which the events of their lives are broadcast as entertainment to the rest of the universe they inhabit. The comedy, the drama, the cartoonishly extreme situations, all of it is real. And all of it is being watched by an audience that includes the Smith family of Langley Falls, Virginia. This reading has a particular implication for Meg that is either comforting or devastating, depending on how you look at it. If the family knows they are being watched and is performing for an audience, then the cruelty directed at Meg may be calculated rather than genuine. A performance of family dysfunction for the entertainment of viewers, with Meg's agreement as the sacrificial victim of the show's comedic architecture. In this reading, when Peter insults Meg, or dismisses her, or treats her as less than human, he is not genuinely mistreating his daughter. He is doing his job as an entertainer. And Meg's willingness to absorb that treatment without leaving is not the passivity of a victim, but the professionalism of an actor who has agreed to play the straight man in a long-running production. This is, admittedly, a reading that requires considerable generosity toward the show's depiction of family dysfunction. But it is more comfortable than the alternative, which is that the show genuinely believes what it shows us about how Meg is treated. The time instability in Family Guy is another element that rewards extended examination. Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy lasted approximately 7 real-time years before she finally gave birth. Characters age and do not age in ways that follow no consistent logic. Stewie has experienced multiple first Christmases, which is impossible, even in a world where the other impossible things in the show are taken as given. The show's internal timeline is simply not coherent, and no amount of fan analysis has been able to reconcile it into a single consistent narrative. The fan theory that attributes this instability to Stewie's time travel is perhaps the most elegant attempt to account for it. The argument is that Stewie has been intervening in the timeline throughout the show's run, undoing events and redirecting sequences and making adjustments large and small that have fractured the show's history into something that cannot be reconciled because it has been altered too many times. We do not see most of these interventions. They happen off-screen, between episodes, in the space where the story is not looking. But the inconsistencies we experience as viewers are the scar tissue of a timeline that has been operated on too many times. There is something deeply appropriate about this theory in the context of everything else we have explored tonight. A show about a family trying to hold itself together, whose history is secretly being rewritten by the most powerful member of that family, who is doing so not out of malice but out of his own needs and fears and attachments. This is not just a fan theory about time travel. It is a description of how families actually work, how the most capable member of a family often quietly shapes and reshapes the family's shared narrative, adjusting the memory of events to make them livable, erasing the things that would break people if they were allowed to remain as they were. The show, filtered through the time travel theory, is a story about love as an act of continual revision. Section 11. The Giant Chicken and the Mythology of Repetition. You cannot properly account for the lore of Family Guy without spending real time with the giant chicken, because the giant chicken is not a running gag. It is a mythology. It is one of the most sustained and elaborately developed recurring elements in the show's history, And the fact that it looks, from the outside, like the most ridiculous thing in a show, full of ridiculous things, has allowed it to carry a surprising amount of genuine thematic weight without anyone fully noticing. Ernie the Giant Chicken is a recurring character who appears periodically throughout the show to engage Peter Griffin in extended, spectacular, mutually destructive physical combat. That these fights are not quick. They are not played lightly. They go on for extended sequences, sometimes several minutes, which is an eternity in a television episode built around rapid-fire comedy, and they take place across increasingly elaborate environments. The two of them have fought through restaurants and offices and construction sites and airports and naval vessels and space. The fights cause enormous collateral damage. Buildings are destroyed. Vehicles are crashed. Innocent bystanders are presumably killed or seriously injured, though the show is never explicit about this. And at the end of each fight, one or both of them appears to be dead, only to return for the next round in a future season. The origin of the feud is specific and deliberately petty. Ernie, who works at a restaurant, gave Peter a coupon for a free meal, and the coupon was expired. Peter objected. Ernie refused to honor it. This is the entire cause of a conflict that has, over the years, consumed entire stretches of time and an incalculable amount of violence. A few dollars worth of food is the spark that created one of animated television's most destructive ongoing rivalries. The joke, on its surface, is about escalation, the comedy of a dispute that has grown completely out of proportion to its origin. But the deeper observation, the one that the gag is really making, and that becomes clearer as it repeats across seasons, is about how people sustain conflicts once those conflicts have achieved a certain intensity. Peter and Ernie do not fight because of the coupon anymore. They fight because the fight is now the relationship. They are defined by their conflict. Without it, they would have no connection to each other at all. Stopping the fight would require one of them to acknowledge that it was always pointless, and the acknowledgement of pointlessness is somehow more devastating than the continuation of the violence. This is, in miniature, a very smart observation about human nature. The most persistent conflicts in human experience are often the ones that have been running long enough that the original cause has been forgotten or overshadowed by the weight of the conflict itself. Peace requires not just a cessation of hostilities, but a willingness to stand in the ruins of the fight and admit that it never needed to happen. And that kind of honesty is harder than most people can manage. The fighting chicken has also been read as a shadow self, the dark double of Peter Griffin. It's the part of him that acts on pure impulse, that escalates every conflict to its maximum destructive potential, that cannot let anything go. Every time Peter fights Ernie, he is fighting the worst version of himself. And the fact that the fight never ends, that Ernie always comes back, that no amount of violence ever finally resolves the conflict. This is the show saying something true about the parts of ourselves that we cannot defeat by fighting them. They go away. They come back. They go away again. And the buildings we have destroyed along the way do not repair themselves. Ernie was confirmed dead after the show's 23rd season, according to statements from the executive producers. The giant chicken, they said, had gone the way of all flesh. This is a phrase borrowed from the King James Bible. It appears in 1 Kings and refers to the inevitability of mortality, the fact that all living things must eventually die. Using this phrase to announce the death of a cartoon giant chicken is either the most elaborate joke the show ever made about its own mythology or an inadvertent piece of poetry. Possibly both. Section 12. The Legacy and the Disturbing Truth. Family Guy has been on television for more than 25 years. It has survived 2 cancellations and a writer's strike and a network relationship that its own creator has publicly compared to a failing marriage. It has generated more lawsuits, regulatory complaints, banned episodes, and edited scenes than almost any other program in the history of broadcast television. It has been watched by hundreds of millions of people across multiple generations, in dozens of countries, in reruns and on streaming platforms, and in late-night cable blocks, and in the original broadcast slots that Fox has moved around repeatedly in ways that have not always been generous to the show's audience. And through all of this, it has been hiding things. Not just the theories and the secrets and the behind-the-scenes stories we have explored tonight. Something more fundamental. Something about what it actually is underneath the noise and the controversy and the reputation. Family Guy is, at its core, a story about longing. Every character in the show, every single one, and including the ones who seem to have been simplified into single-note parodies of themselves in the later seasons, is driven by something they want and cannot quite reach. Peter longs to be more significant than he is. Not richer, not smarter, but more present, more real, more noticed by a world that seems to process him as background noise. Brian longs to be taken seriously, not just by the other characters, but by himself, to close the gap between who he believes he is and the evidence of who he actually behaves as. Stewie, in the original conception, longs for power and domination, but underneath that, and the show occasionally lets you see underneath it, he longs for the respect that comes with being genuinely dangerous. The evil genius baby who wants to conquer the world is, at some level, not a child who wants to be taken seriously. Meg longs simply to be loved. Not romantically, not conditionally, just loved in the basic, foundational way that she apparently cannot find in her own household. Lois, who is perhaps the most underwritten of the main characters in critical analyses of the show, longs for the life she might have had. She comes from money, from culture, from a world of possibilities that she walked away from, or was removed from, when she married Peter and had children. The early Lois is someone who has made peace with that choice and found genuine satisfaction in the family she built. The later Lois, the one who has been changed by years of careless writing, is someone for whom that peace has broken down, and the bitterness that occasionally surfaces in her is the residue of paths not taken. And none of these longings are small. They are not cartoon longings. They are the particular, personal, specific longings of people who are living lives that have not quite matched what they imagined, who are trying to find meaning and connection in circumstances that generate more friction than warmth. The fact that all of this is happening inside the most aggressively silly animated comedy in network television history does not make it less true. It makes it more interesting. The disturbing truth behind Family Guy is not any one of the facts or theories we have explored tonight. It is not the near miss on September 11th, or the abortion episode banned from American screens, or the dark fan theory about Peter in a psychiatric facility, or the evidence that the show's entire history has been fractured by a baby with a time machine. All of those things are part of the story. But the truth that sits underneath all of them is simpler and stranger than any of them individually. The disturbing truth is that this show, which looks from the outside like a machine for producing shock and crude comedy, which has spent 25 years being cited by watchdog organizations as evidence that American television has lost its moral compass, which has been the subject of federal complaints and congressional concern and foreign government bans. This show was built from one person's most private creative vocabulary. His memories of a particular city in Rhode Island, his love of Frank Sinatra records and Rex Harrison performances, his complicated feelings about intelligence and ambition and what it means to want to be taken seriously, that his specific sense of humor about the gap between who people believe themselves to be and who they actually are, his willingness to make jokes about death because he once came very close to it in an airport lounge and found that humor was the only response that felt adequate. And then that intensely personal thing was handed to hundreds of millions of people who took it and made it part of their own interior lives, in ways that the person who made it never expected and cannot fully control. There are people alive today who experience something genuinely important in specific episodes of Family Guy, who watched Brian die and felt, without expecting it, genuinely sad, and who were then furious when the show undid that death for ratings because the show had briefly made them care about a cartoon dog and then used that caring for a stunt. But who watched Meg's confrontation with her family and recognized in it something they had never seen articulated anywhere else. Who watched Stewie alone in his crib in the earliest episodes, constructing elaborate schemes and speaking to no one who could understand him, and felt something about the particular loneliness of being intelligent in a world that has not quite caught up with you. The show did not intend to be those things for those people, but it became them anyway. Because that is what happens when you build something with enough specificity and enough honesty and enough genuine darkness. It travels. It finds the people who need it, and it becomes something more than what anyone planned. The city of Quahog still stands. 31 Spooner Street is still there. The Drunken Clam is still open, if you know how to get there. And the Providence skyline still shimmers in the background of every outdoor shot, recognizable to anyone who has ever lived in that part of the world. Ernie the giant chicken is gone, and Peter Griffin, the lovable and terrible man at the center of all of this, a man who is possibly a figment of grief, possibly a character in a story being written by his own dog, possibly a soul working through consequences in a dimension between lives, is still sitting on his couch, still watching television, still drinking beer, still occasionally looking toward the window as though trying to remember something he once knew very clearly and has since let drift just slightly out of reach. Whatever it was that he is trying to remember, it is still there somewhere. In the quiet, in the dark, between one season and the next. It is still there. Yeah, thank you so much for spending this time here tonight. If this kind of slow, careful lore telling is why you come to this channel, then please do like this video and subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore. It genuinely makes everything we do here possible. And this community means the world. Leave a comment and tell me which part of tonight's lore got under your skin the most. I read every single one of them, always. And if there is a piece of lore you think I missed, something that should have been in here, tell me. The lore never ends. Sleep well, wherever you are. We will be here when you wake up. End of script. Uncle Guy. Lore, fall asleep to the disturbing truth. Behind Family Guy lore section, the unspoken architecture of the drunken clam and the brotherhood of Quahog. One of the most quietly meaningful elements of Family Guy that rarely receives the analytical attention it deserves is the drunken clam itself. The bar where Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire gather, episode after episode, season after season, to drink and complain and watch sports and generally avoid the responsibilities that wait for them at home. On the surface, the drunken clam is set dressing, a location, a place where characters go when the scene requires them to be somewhere other than the Griffin living room. But if you look at it across the whole run of the show, it is something more than that. The drunken clam is where the show depicts male friendship in its most unguarded and most honest form. When Peter and his friends are at the clam, the usual comic exaggeration of the show relaxes slightly. They sit at the bar and talk. They have opinions about things. They worry about their wives and their jobs and the slow erosion of their relevance in a world that has been moving away from them without asking permission. These conversations are not always funny. Some of them are genuinely poignant. Moments where the show pauses the comedy long enough to let its characters be tired and a little lost in the way that middle-aged men often are without having the language to say so directly. But the friendship between Peter and Joe Swanson is a particularly interesting case study in how the show understood and then stopped understanding its own characters. When Joe was introduced in Season 1 in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, he was immediately the most admired man on Spooner Street. He is a police officer. He is athletic. He was injured in the line of duty and confined to a wheelchair, but this has not diminished his courage or his capability or the respect he commands from everyone around him. Peter, who is introduced as being somewhat jealous of Joe's popularity, is eventually won over, and the friendship that develops between them in the early seasons is one of the most genuinely warm relationships in the show. The early Joe is drawn with respect, that his disability is part of his character rather than the defining thing about his character. He is not a wheelchair user first and a person second. He is a specific human being, brave, principled, physically formidable in his own way, loyal to his friends, who happens to use a wheelchair. The show does not condescend to him. When Joe does something impressive, it is impressive regardless of his disability. When the show makes jokes about his disability, those jokes come from a place of genuine affection and familiarity rather than mockery. Compare this to the Joe of later seasons, in which his disability has become progressively more central to jokes at his expense. His wife has fallen out of love with him, and the show treats this as wambamuri rather than tragedy. And his friends, including Peter, mock him in ways that the early show would never have permitted. The arc of Joe's treatment by the show mirrors the arc of the show's overall ethical decline. You can trace the show's diminishing care for its own characters through the way it treats Joe Swanson. Section: The Deeper Mythology of Brian and Stewie's Friendship. The road to episodes deserves sustained examination beyond what we have given them, because these episodes represent something genuinely unusual in the history of animated television. They began in season 2 with Road to Rhode Island and continued periodically throughout the show's run. And they are consistently ranked among the show's very best work by fans and critics across every era of the show's history. What makes the Road to episodes function at such a high level is that they remove Brian and Stewie from the context that usually constrains them and places them in situations that require genuine emotional honesty. Without Peter's chaos to react to, without Lois's patience to test, without the domestic architecture of Spooner Street to provide structure, Brian and Stewie have to exist purely in relation to each other. And the relationship that emerges from this, the specific, complex, deeply felt friendship between a man in a dog's body and a baby who is genuinely not sure what he is one of the most interesting relationships in adult animation. Brian and Stewie need each other in ways that the show makes visible but rarely explains. Brian is the only person in the show who consistently takes Stewie seriously as an intelligence and as an individual. Everyone else either cannot understand him or ignores him. Brian listens. Brian argues back. Brian treats Stewie as a peer, which is an extraordinary thing to extend to a 1-year-old, but which Stewie receives with an emotional need that the evil genius characterization normally keeps carefully hidden. Being taken seriously by someone you respect is one of the most important human needs, and Stewie gets it from Brian and from essentially no one else. What Brian gets from Stewie is more complicated and harder to articulate. At some level, Brian needs Stewie because Stewie is the only person in the show who actually challenges Brian intellectually. Everyone else is either beneath him or indifferent to him. Stewie is neither. Stewie respects Brian's intelligence while being fully aware of Brian's failings, fully aware, and occasionally devastating in his articulation of them. Being challenged and held accountable by someone whose opinion you value is not comfortable, but it is essential. And Brian, in his best moments, recognizes this about his friendship with Stewie. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8, in which the two of them are accidentally locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode talking to each other with no cutaways, no external gags, no interruptions, is the show at its absolute best. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has considered using it on himself. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him in terms that are, for Stewie, remarkably direct. The episode strips away every layer of comedy and leaves two characters sitting in a small room having the kind of honest conversation that most people never manage to have with anyone. The episode was controversial among some viewers who found its emotional directness out of keeping with the show they had expected. It remains, for others, the single greatest thing the show ever produced. Section: The Real Cost of the Show's Longevity. One of the things that makes Family Guy's story genuinely melancholy, rather than simply critical, is the question of what was lost by the show continuing past its natural endpoint. Seth MacFarlane himself identified that endpoint in the interview we discussed earlier. He said he thought 7 seasons was the right lifespan for a television series. He was talking about Family Guy. But he was saying that the show had said what it needed to say, and that continuing it was an act of commercial rather than creative logic. This is an unusual thing to say publicly about your own show while it is still running, and it was widely reported and discussed at the time. MacFarlane did not walk it back. He stood behind it. And the evidence of what happened to the show over the following decade suggests that his instinct was correct. The specific vision that made the early show extraordinary required sustained, active creative oversight from the person who held that vision. When that oversight diminished, as MacFarlane's attention was drawn to films, to The Orville, to his music career, to all the other projects that a talent of his scale inevitably generates, the show did not die. It continued. But it continued the way a fire continues when its main fuel source has been reduced. Less bright, less focused, spreading in directions that generate more heat than light. The shows MacFarlane made when he had the bandwidth to give them his full attention, particularly The Orville, his science fiction series that premiered in 2017, and has developed into one of the most thoughtful explorations of humanist values in recent television, reveal what he is capable of when he is fully imbibed. The Orville is warm and funny and willing to sit with genuine moral complexity in a way that later Family Guy rarely managed. It is the work of the same mind that built the early seasons of Family Guy, but operating with full attention and genuine commitment rather than divided energy and contractual obligation. There is something sad about this. I don't know if you think about it too long. The show that made Seth MacFarlane famous is not the show that best represents what Seth MacFarlane is. The show that carries his name is not, in its current form, the show he would choose to make. He is connected to it by contract and by voice. He still walks into a recording booth and speaks as Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire, but the creative distance between him and the show's day-to-day reality is enormous, and it shows. In April 2025, Family Guy was renewed for 4 additional seasons in what was described as a substantial deal with Disney, the parent company that now controls Fox's entertainment assets. This renewal takes the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with Family Guy's 30th anniversary. 30 years. The show that Seth MacFarlane thought should have ended after 7 seasons will instead celebrate 3 decades of existence. Whether this is a triumph or a tragedy depends entirely on what you think art is for. If art is for commerce, for generating revenue, for building brand value, for creating content that can be licensed and distributed and monetized across multiple platforms for decades, then Family Guy's longevity is an unqualified success story. It is cheap to produce, valuable in syndication, globally recognized, and thoroughly embedded in the infrastructure of the entertainment industry. It will continue making money for Disney for as long as Disney chooses to air it, and Disney has made clear it intends to keep airing it well into the decade. Now, if art is for saying something, for the particular kind of communication that happens between a creative person with something genuine to express, and an audience who receives that expression and is changed by it, however slightly, then Family Guy's longevity is more complicated. The show that is still on the air in 2025 is not the same show that made 22 million people lean forward on their couches on January 31st, 1999, because something on their screen was saying something they had not quite heard before. That show existed for 3 seasons. Then it was canceled. Then it came back and ran for a long time, some of it good and some of it not. And it became something different from what it was. And it has continued being something different for longer than it was ever the original thing. The original thing is still there, though. The first 3 seasons are still on the shelf, still available, still exactly as they were. Stewie is still building his weapons. Brian is still the most grounded person in a house full of chaos. Peter still loves his family badly, but genuinely. Meg is still just a teenager who wants to belong somewhere. Quahog still has the Providence skyline in the background. The drunken Clam is still there, and Peter and Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire are still sitting at the bar having the kinds of conversations that middle-aged men have when they are trying to hold on to something and are not entirely sure what it is. That show, the original one, is one of the most genuinely original things that has ever aired on American television. And the truth behind it, the full truth, that's the one that takes in all of the secrets and the theories and the creation story, and the near-death, and the banned episodes and the fan theories and the mythology of the giant chicken, and the poetry of Meg's suffering, and the specific sadness of Brian's unrealized ambition. That truth is more interesting and more complex and more worth knowing than almost anything the show ever put on screen. Which is not a knock on the show. It is simply the observation that great things are usually built by people who contain multitudes, and that the multitudes are almost always richer than the things that emerge from them. Seth MacFarlane contains multitudes. Family Guy caught some of them. And the ones it caught were more than enough to build something that, when it was at its best, was genuinely extraordinary. Section, The Voices Inside the Machine. What the casting reveals. The casting decisions behind Family Guy are, taken together, one of the most revealing windows into what the show was meant to be and what it became. Every principal voice actor was chosen with extraordinary care in the early going. And the specific choices made, and the alternative choices that were almost made, tell a story about the show's identity that is worth examining in full. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, was not the first choice for the role. When Fox moved Family Guy from pilot to full series, the network pushed for a different casting direction on Lois. Borstein, who had been a cast member on Mad TV and had been part of the creative development of the show, Molly was almost replaced by a more conventionally trained voice actress who might have given Lois a more neutral, less idiosyncratic sound. McFarlane reportedly pushed back on this, believing that Borstein's specific qualities, the warmth underneath the exasperation, the particular intelligence she brought to the role, the way her voice communicated that Lois was genuinely trying to hold things together, were irreplaceable. He was right. Lois without Borstein is impossible to imagine, and the fact that the network nearly took that away is one of those near misses that sounds small in retrospect, but that would have changed the fundamental character of the show. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, he got the role through an audition that McFarlane has described in interviews as one of the most surprising and unsettling things he witnessed in the casting process. Green came in with a voice that nobody on the creative team had expected, a specific, peculiar voice that his friend and fellow actor Charlie Corsmo had dared him to use. The voice was based on Buffalo Bill, the deeply disturbing antagonist from The Silence of the Lambs, as played by Ted Levine. Green performed the entire audition in what was essentially a child-appropriate version of a movie serial killer's voice, and McFarlane found it so odd and so funny and so uniquely right for Chris that he hired him on the spot. The voice of a beloved cartoon teenager is technically a reference to one of cinema's most unsettling characters. Yet most people who have watched Family Guy for years do not know this. Mila Kunis came to the role of Meg in Season 2, replacing Lacey Chabert, who had voiced the character in the first season before her schedule became too demanding due to her role on Party of Five. McFarlane has described the Kunis audition as involving multiple callbacks in which he told her to speak more slowly, and then to enunciate more, and then asked her to come back again until she finally told him she had it under control and he hired her. Kunis was 15 years old when she was hired to voice Meg. She has voiced the character through her teens, her 20s, her 30s, and into her 40s, which means she has lived her entire adult life in the company of a character who is herself perpetually 17. The experience of voicing a teenager who never ages while you yourself grow through all of life's major transitions is itself a strange kind of mirror. The question of who might have voiced Brian is one of the show's more haunting what-ifs. McFarlane has said publicly on social media that William H. Macy auditioned for the role of Brian in 1997, before the show was ordered to series. Macy did not get the part. McFarlane added, characteristically, that he thought he had made a bad call. The idea of William H. Macy, with his specific worn quality, his voice that carries the weight of intelligence and disappointment in equal measure, voicing Brian Griffin is genuinely interesting to sit with. The character McFarlane built by voicing Brian himself is the character the show needed. But a Brian voiced by Macy would have been a different and equally interesting character, one whose flaws might have read as more tragic than comic, one whose loneliness might have been more visibly painful. The show that McFarlane made is not the show that would have emerged from that casting choice, and both versions of that show are worth imagining. Section: The Controversy Engine and What It Reveals About American Culture. Family Guy has been a reliable controversy engine since its first season, and the controversies it has generated over the years constitute a kind of running index of American cultural anxiety. The things that Family Guy has been blamed for, criticized for, banned for, and formally complained about to federal agencies trace a line through the fault lines of American social debate across more than 2 decades. Watch the Parents Television Council, whose complaints about Family Guy have been so regular and so sustained that they constitute a kind of parallel archive of the show's history, filed formal FCC complaints in response to episodes that touched on everything from religious satire to sexual content to the representation of disability. Each complaint, if you read them, is a document about what a certain segment of American society believed ought to be protected from comedy at any given moment. The topics that generated the most sustained opposition shifted over the years, tracking changes in American cultural politics with unexpected precision. What was dangerous in 2000 was different from what was dangerous in 2010, and the show's navigation of these shifting zones of sensitivity tells you something interesting about how quickly American culture moves. The show's relationship to religious content is particularly instructive. Family Guy has made jokes about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and virtually every other major world religion, with more or less equal lack of reverence for any of them. This even-handedness has not protected it from accusations of targeting specific faiths, particularly Judaism, given the delayed release of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and Islam, given the turban cowboy situation and various other episodes that touched on Islamic themes over the years. But reading across the show's entire body of religious humor, the consistent position is that religion is a human institution, and therefore subject to the same scrutiny as any other human institution. MacFarlane, who is openly atheist, has never hidden his personal skepticism. But the show's treatment of religion is not primarily atheist advocacy. It is more accurately described as a kind of impatient secular humanism, a show made by someone who finds organized religion's claims exaggerated, but who has genuine respect for the human need that drives religious practice. The political humor in Family Guy is another area where the show's relationship to American culture deserves careful attention rather than simple categorization. The show has consistently positioned itself as politically liberal, and this positioning is real. MacFarlane has been publicly committed to liberal causes and policies throughout his career, and the show reflects those commitments. But the show's political humor, at its best, was never simply propaganda. It was satire. And the best political satire does not simply mock the side you oppose. It holds up a mirror to the entire landscape of political life, including the side you favor, and asks awkward questions about all of it. The later seasons of the show moved away from this towards something more explicitly partisan, and the comedy suffered for it. When Brian delivers a political speech, it does not function as satire. It functions as advocacy. The difference between satire and advocacy is the difference between showing something and arguing for something. And advocacy, in the context of a comedy, that is almost always less funny than satire. The early seasons made liberal political observations through jokes that could be appreciated regardless of the viewer's political position, because the jokes were about human fallibility rather than about political teams. The later seasons lost this quality, and the humor became narrower and less interesting as a result. Section: The Geography of Grief and the Show's Secret Heart. Let us end the lore with something quieter. Something that does not require theories or secrets or speculation, just attention. There is a reason that Brian Griffin has resonated with viewers more deeply than any other character on the show. And it is not his wit or his sophistication or his failed writing career or his love life or even his death and resurrection in season 12. Now, it is because Brian is the character through whom Family Guy most consistently and most honestly engages with grief. Not the grief of losing a person, though that is in there too. The grief of time passing. The grief of watching your ambitions recede in proportion to your experience of how hard the world actually is. The grief of being intelligent enough to know what you are not achieving without being wise enough to know how to stop measuring yourself against it. The grief of loving people who do not love you back the way you need, or loving people who do love you back but who you know you will eventually lose. Brian drinks. This is established early and maintained throughout the show's run. He drinks too much and too consistently for it to be a casual character trait. It is a response to something. And what it is a response to is visible in all the things Brian says and does and fails to do. He drinks because the gap between who he is and who he wants to be is painful, and the pain needs somewhere to go. He drinks because the world he inhabits does not take him seriously, no matter how hard he works to deserve serious consideration. He drinks because Lois will never be with him, and he has never found anyone else who quite fills that particular space. He drinks because the novel is not finished, and probably never will be. He drinks because being a dog, or if you accept the theory, being a person in a dog's body, is a genuinely difficult way to exist. And dignity, which Brian wants enormously, is almost impossible to maintain under those circumstances. Brian's relationship to writing is one of the most quietly honest things in the entire show. He has been working on a novel for the entire run of Family Guy. He occasionally finishes it. When he finishes it, it is either terrible or successful for reasons that have nothing to do with its actual quality. He talks about writing constantly. He does not write constantly. The gap between his self-concept as a writer and his actual output is the most relatable thing about him, which is perhaps why fans have consistently found him the most sympathetic character, even after years of the show making him less sympathetic. The episode Brian and Stewie, which we discussed in the context of the Road to Episodes, is worth revisiting as an ending point because it contains the show's most direct engagement with these themes. Brian keeps a gun in a safety deposit box. He has thought about using it on himself. He admits this to Stewie in the quiet of a locked vault, in the middle of the night, in language that is careful and specific and clearly not comedy. Stewie does not joke about it. He tells Brian that he loves him. He tells him that he would be devastated if Brian were gone. The episode ends with both of them sitting in the vault, having said the truest things either of them has ever said on the show, waiting for morning to come. That episode is Family Guy at its most honest. The show rarely goes there. Most of the time it is doing something else entirely, entertaining, offending, being weird, filling time with cutaways, processing Seth MacFarlane's cultural references and personal obsessions into 22 minutes of television. But when it goes there, when it touches the grief and the loneliness and the love that live underneath all the comedy, those moments are extraordinary. They are the secret heart of a show that has spent 25 years pretending, most of the time, not to have one. The town of Quahog holds this heart. The drunken Clam holds it. The bookshelves in Brian's room hold it. Peter's face, occasionally, in the moments when the animators were paying attention and the writers gave them something real to work with. Peter's face holds it. These characters are more than their worst moments. They are more than what the show made them in the seasons when it stopped caring about who they were supposed to be. And the people who have loved this show across its entire history, who loved it first and hardest and have never quite gotten over what it became, they know this. They have always known this. That is the disturbing truth behind Family Guy. Not that it is dark, though it is. Not that it hides things, though it does. Not that its creator almost died before he got to make it, though he did. The disturbing truth is that it was built to contain something real about human life, about the specific longing and love and disappointment and absurdity of being a person in the world, and that something real is still in there, still visible, still worth finding. Even now. Even after everything. Section 13, the neighborhood of Quahog and what the surrounding characters represent. You cannot fully understand Family Guy's lore without spending time with the people who surround the Griffins on Spooner Street. Because those characters, Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, Cleveland Brown, and the rotating cast of neighbors and friends who pass through Quahog, are not merely supporting players. They are, each of them, a different lens through which the show examines the particular experience of working-class American manhood at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. Start with Joe Swanson, who is introduced in the season one episode A Hero Sits Next Door. When Joe arrives on the block, he is immediately the most impressive person on Spooner Street. He is a police officer. He is athletic and disciplined. He was injured in the line of duty while pursuing criminals, and is now a wheelchair user. But this fact, in the episode's presentation, does not diminish him. If anything, the show treats his disability as evidence of the seriousness and commitment with which he approaches his life and his work. But he did not become a wheelchair user through carelessness. He became one while trying to protect other people. Peter's initial jealousy of Joe is played entirely straight. Joe is genuinely admirable, and Peter's awareness of his own relative ordinariness in comparison is a completely understandable response. The relationship between Peter and Joe that develops in the early seasons is one of the show's most genuinely warm friendships. These are two men who have nothing obvious in common. One is lazy and chaotic and operates on impulse. The other is disciplined and serious and driven by duty. And yet their friendship is real and specific and grounded in the particular kind of loyalty that develops between men who spend enough time together in the right context. The Drunken Clam is that context. Shared time, shared beer, and shared complaints about their respective lives. Joe becomes part of Peter's inner circle not because the show needs him there, but because these two specific people have found something genuine in each other. Compare the early Joe to the Joe of later seasons, and the decline is as visible as it is in Peter or Brian. Over time, Joe's disability becomes progressively more central, to jokes that are not affectionate but mocking. His wife Bonnie falls out of love with him, and the show treats this as either comedy or as a running grievance for Joe to suffer through, rather than as the genuinely painful situation it would be for a real person. His friends, Quahog, including Peter, the person who was most moved by Joe's impressiveness when they first met, begin mocking him in ways that the early show never would have permitted. Thus, the arc of Joe's treatment by the show is a precise mirror of the show's overall ethical decline, and it is one of the clearest indicators of how much the show lost its sense of the real cost of its own cruelty. Glenn Quagmire is a more complicated case because Quagmire was always designed to be morally problematic in ways that Joe was not. His characterization in the early seasons is built around his extraordinary promiscuity and his complete lack of shame about it. The jokes about Quagmire are jokes about the specific absurdity of a man who approaches every possible romantic or sexual encounter with identical and unlimited enthusiasm, who is incapable of prioritizing any connection over his compulsive need for novelty, and who somehow manages to maintain the goodwill of everyone around him despite the chaos his behavior creates. Now, the early Quagmire is funny because his behavior is played as pure comedy. There are no real victims in his sphere because the show carefully constructs his encounters in ways that keep them on the right side of problematic. The later seasons abandon this careful construction and allow Quagmire's behavior to become genuinely disturbing in ways the show acknowledges but does not know how to handle. The episode Quagmire's Mom, which the PTC formally complained about for its depiction of statutory rape, is an example of the show failing to navigate the line between dark comedy and normalizing something genuinely harmful. The show's growing tendency in later seasons to simply depict transgressive behavior without the comedic framing that previously made it workable is a general failure that Quagmire's storylines exemplify clearly. Cleveland Brown of Bang, before departing for his own spin-off series, represents another aspect of the show's examination of friendship and identity. In the early seasons, Cleveland is the most level-headed member of Peter's group, measured, patient, occasionally given to wisdom that lands with unexpected weight amid the chaos of a typical Quahog evening. His relationship with his wife Loretta, which eventually ends in divorce, is handled with more genuine feeling than most Family Guy storylines of comparable subject matter. And his eventual departure for Steubenville, North Carolina, where he starred in The Cleveland Show from 2009 to 2013, is one of those decisions that the show made for commercial reasons. Creating a spin-off around a supporting character that accidentally hollowed out something real. The group at the Drunken Clam was a specific four-way chemistry, and removing one element changed it permanently. The broader Quahog community that surrounds these core characters is drawn with a level of specificity that rewards attention. Mort Goldman, the hypochondriac pharmacist, and his son Neil, who has an unrequited obsession with Meg, represent one specific strain of working-class Rhode Island social life. Quagmire's various neighbors and the peripheral characters who pass through the show over the years represent others. The world of Quahog, when the show is working well, feels genuinely inhabited, like a place where people have histories and routines and relationships that extend beyond the edges of any single episode. Add Section 14. The show's relationship to its own history and the sadness of self-awareness. Family Guy has, over its long run, become increasingly aware of its own reputation and its own history, and the way it has engaged with that awareness is one of the more interesting and more melancholy aspects of the show's later existence. The show knows what people say about it. The show knows what it was and what it became. And it has at various points tried to address this through meta-humor, through characters acknowledging the show's declining quality, through fourth-wall breaks that reference the show's history, through episodes that are explicitly about the experience of watching Family Guy. The episode Back to the Pilot, which we discussed in the context of the two-universe theory, is also a remarkably direct piece of self-examination. Brian and Stewie travel back to the first episode of the show and observe the original versions of the characters. The original Peter is kinder and more grounded. The original Quahog feels slightly different, warmer, less extreme. The observation is unmistakable. The show the current characters inhabit is not the same show that the original characters inhabited, and this difference is presented as something worth noticing, even if the episode does not dwell on what it means. The episode Cutaway Land, which attempted to make the show's most criticized formal feature into its subject, is worth examining because it reveals something about the show's limits of self-awareness. But the concept, Peter and Lois traveling between cutaway gags as though the cutaway world were a real place, is clever in conception. The execution, however, uses recycled cutaways from earlier seasons and concludes with Peter waking up and discovering the whole thing was a dream. The episode was supposed to be a celebration of the show's signature comedy device. Instead, it became an inadvertent demonstration of exactly the creative problems critics had identified. Recycled material, lazy structure, a reset ending that refuses to commit to its own premise. The gap between the show's self-awareness and its willingness to actually do something with that self-awareness is one of the defining characteristics of the later seasons. The show knows it has been going too long. The show knows the characters have changed in ways that are not always improvements. The show knows the cutaways have taken over at the expense of storytelling. The show knows these things and makes jokes about knowing them, and then continues doing all of them, season after season, because knowing something and changing something are very different capacities. There is something genuinely interesting about a show that has developed this kind of reflexive self-knowledge without the ability to act on it. It is as though the show has become conscious of its own condition in the way that certain people are conscious of their own bad habits, fully aware, often articulate about the awareness, and completely unable to translate that awareness into different behavior. But the fourth wall breaks in later seasons read less like clever metacomedy and more like confessions that go nowhere. A show acknowledging that it has been on too long is not the same as a show that has figured out how to be on longer without declining. It is simply a show that has found a new category of joke to make while continuing to do the thing it is joking about. Section 15. The Strange Persistence of Quahog and Why the Show Cannot End. One of the questions that Family Guy has generated across its entire run, particularly in the later seasons when Seth MacFarlane publicly expressed his desire to conclude the show, is, why does it keep going? The answer is not complicated. It is economic, as we have discussed, but the economic answer only explains the network's decision to keep ordering it. It does not explain why the show continues to find an audience, however smaller that audience has become compared to the show's peak. Why it continues to be discussed and theorized about and taken seriously by people who care about animated television. Part of the answer is inertia. Family Guy has been running for so long that it has become a fixture in the landscape of American entertainment in the way that only a handful of television programs ever become. The Simpsons is that kind of fixture. Saturday Night Live is that kind of fixture. These are things that have been present for so long that their absence would constitute a genuine change in the cultural environment. A removal, however small, of something that people have always been able to count on being there. Family Guy has reached that threshold. Even people who stopped watching the show years ago know it is still airing, and there is a comfort in that knowledge that is difficult to explain, but that is real. Part of the answer is the show's deep integration into the infrastructure of digital media. Family Guy was one of the first network shows to achieve significant online presence, partly because its cutaway format was perfectly suited to the clip-sharing culture of early YouTube. A 30-second cutaway from Family Guy could be extracted from its episode, uploaded, and shared without context. And it worked independently as a joke in a way that most television comedy does not. This gave the show an online audience that exceeded its television audience during certain periods, and it built a familiarity with the show's characters and style that persisted even as the show's formal television ratings declined. Part of the answer, perhaps the most important part, is that Family Guy at its best, the original 3 seasons, the best episodes of the revival period, the road to episodes, the moments when the show remembered what it was, represents something that is genuinely worth remembering and returning to. People who fell in love with the show in 1999 or 2005 or in reruns on Adult Swim at 2 in the morning carry that love with them. And the existence of the show in its current form is connected to the existence of those memories, even when the current form does not deserve the attachment. You keep checking in because you remember what it was, and because every season there are a handful of episodes that briefly remind you why you ever cared in the first place, and because the characters, even in their degraded later forms, are still in some meaningful sense the characters you love, Fadyamnyad, still carrying traces of who they were in the years when the show was building something, rather than coasting on what it had built. This is the strange persistence of Quahog, not the fictional city, which is stable and consistent and will presumably continue to exist on Fox's schedule until the contract with Disney runs its course. But the Quahog that exists in the imaginations of the people who watched the show when it was at its best. The warmer, funnier, more emotionally honest version of that place that was running from 1999 to roughly 2007, before the character changes became too extreme, and the cutaways became too dominant, and the heart began to thin out. That Quahog is still there, preserved in the episodes that still exist, and in the memories of the people who watch them. And the reason the show cannot fully end, the reason it keeps pulling people back even now, is that people are still looking for that version of the place. They are still hoping, each season, that it might come back. Section 19. Final Reflection. Why the lore matters. Every piece of lore we have examined tonight, the origin story, the near-death, the hidden architecture of Quahog, the theories about Peter's grief and Stewie's perception and Brian's nature, the banned episodes, the strange predictive moments, the mythology of the chicken, shot the secret heart of the whole endeavor. Every single one of these things matters for the same reason. Because understanding where something came from and what it is actually made of changes your relationship to it. Most people who have watched Family Guy have done so casually, in the way that most people consume television, as background, as entertainment, as a way to fill time or relax or laugh without thinking too hard. And that is completely fine. The show works on that level. The jokes land, the characters are recognizable, the world is comfortable and familiar. But the people who go deeper, who sit with the show long enough and carefully enough to see the Providence skyline in the background and recognize what it means, who notice the specific voice McFarlane uses for Brian and understand why, not who feel the weight of Meg's suffering across the seasons and understand it as something more than lazy writing, who see in the giant chicken fight something more than a running gag, those people are getting something different from the show. Something richer. Something that rewards the attention it requires. The lore of Family Guy is, at its deepest level, the lore of a particular human life. One spent drawing cartoons from the age of 2, studying animation in Providence, nearly boarding a doomed plane, building a world from the materials of that life and broadcasting it to hundreds of millions of strangers. Seth MacFarlane's fingerprints are all over every frame of the original Family Guy, and learning to see those fingerprints does not diminish the show, it deepens it. Yet it makes the comedy more resonant and the darker moments more true and the whole thing more worth caring about. The story is not over. The show is still running. Quahog is still there. And the truth behind it, the whole strange, layered, occasionally disturbing truth, is still waiting for whoever wants to go looking for it. Sleep well. The lore will be here when you wake up.